Hey everyone, welcome to our Trustmark working group Take Action series. We're in week 3. We kind of have overtaken Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and we're talking about how do we take action on getting more secure in our environments. So we're specifically talking about Trustmark here, but it could be a CIS control, it could be ISO 27001. And it all starts with just doing a little something every single day. So we decided this week or this month, every week we tackle a topic. Our first week, and I'm curious if you could put in the chat for us, who did you assign as your CSO? Who is your cybersecurity officer? Who is looking over and making decisions around what cybersecurity actions you should be taking?
And that,
go ahead.
We have some new members, and while we're waiting on the audience, because there's about a 30-second delay as we kick up, but as we're waiting on the audience to answer that question, first thing answered, as Dave said, who was your ISO that you picked in week 1? And since Mark, I think you haven't been on one of these yet, and Mike
not
Simmel,
successfully.
That's true. You are on your tertiary attempt at this, so that's fair. Mark, so if you don't mind, just introduce yourself for everybody, and then also who in your organization by role is your ISO?
Yeah, so Mark Menzies, President and Chief Technology Officer of Overview Technology Solutions, and we're a hybrid solutions provider. And in our organization, it's me, for our primary environments. And there's the reason for that is that it's just kind of we tried others, and the buck sort of stops here. It was always a decision tree, and I always was at the end of it. So we just made it official.
That is actually awesome, Mark, because one of the things we talked about is that you have to have somebody that is going to own the actual executive function and governance function in order to be the ISO. And if you are finding yourself completely limited by your role from a decision-making perspective, it would have put someone in a very hard place to have you not be the ISO, but also be the person that goes to for that last answer finally, right? Might as well. So is that kind of how you figured that out yourself as well?
I mean, I empower the team. I give them decision-making ability, but at the end of the day, when they need clarification on a policy, when something new comes up, they're going to come to me just to be 100% certain. So I don't involve myself in everything. I shouldn't be involved in everything, but when push comes to shove, when there's something new, I get involved. When something needs clarification, I need to be involved. When the stakes are very high, I need to at least be informed or briefed. Sometimes, question asked.
That's awesome. Mike, I believe you've also not been on. So if you don't mind, would you introduce yourself? And if you have the answer, who's the ISO in your organization?
Sure. Well, I have the answer, and that's easy. But I'm Mike Simmel, and I've been in MSP. Actually, I was in the industry long before they called us MSPs. And I've been a cybersecurity and compliance consultant for the last 12 years. I've also served as CIO for a regulated hospital and a regulated K-12 school district. I'm the ISO in my organization, and I have been in other organizations because I've been the one that they hand the pen to and say, can you please attest to your cybersecurity implementation? And if my signature is going to be on that piece of paper, I don't want to have any doubts about what we did to meet those requirements.
That's awesome. Chris, have you been on one of these yet? If not, I mean, everybody knows who you are.
I have been on one before.
All right, perfect. We'll keep moving. Dave, back to you, bud. What are we doing? Continued call to actions.
So that was our first week. Who's your ISO? This week is what did you start building your asset list, right?
Right. Last week was, yeah.
Yeah. Did you go to your RMM, put all that in Excel? Did you start gathering that info? So in the chat.
Yeah, right here.
Yeah. Did you start building your asset list? Yes or no? That's all we're looking for. Did you take action? That's what we're looking for.
All right. Hopefully some of those will come in and people will say, yep, they built an awesome asset list. And if not, I'm just going to lie and say they did, but I couldn't bring it up on screen. So, all right. Dave, while we're waiting on that interaction, what are we talking about today? What's the goal of today?
Yeah. So I think we want to how do we dive into a control? How do we really understand it and start to figure it out? and look at it. So I thought it'd be good if maybe we just kind of at random pick a control, and then we can all riff on it and talk about it.
Makes sense.
I don't know if anybody has any suggestions, but what's the control for network segmentation? Like what control is that?
12.2, right? And actually segmentation is only a small part of 12.2 actually.
Oh,
but so just to make sure before we get going, the call to action for you watching this right now is one thing. Do what we're about to do. As a team, get together, look at a safeguard, look at a control, and say, what's all a part of this? And then start making action items, because that's how you do anything. You know, I was talking to somebody yesterday at this conference, and a common theme came up, and it's whether or not companies choose to execute. There are a lot of companies that have ideas. There are tons of people that say they're going to do something. It is those that get it done that actually succeed. So let's do this. So we're going to role play through this, and I think we're going to do 12.2. But in order to do it, the first thing you should do is take out the control and any guidance and guiding materials that you can find for it, right? Does everybody agree with that pretty much, Chris? Would you say?
I would say, yes, I agree. I think there's a few other things that go with it.
Boom. Okay, so we are going to pull those out. This is a visual guide that I have for CIS that I use. The only things that really matter for our purposes today are going to be mostly the yellow and the orange. The side greens are basically the other things this ties into. But it says we need to, at the minimum, address three things: segmentation, principle of least privilege, and accessibility. Wait, what? We need to care about people being able to access the network? This is crazy talk. I digress. All right, so who wants to kick it off? What are the things we need to think about? And we'll just keep a virtual notepad over here in our head. What are the things we need to be dealing with if we're trying to solve this control? Who wants to go first?
Well, when I think about this control is like, what scope are we looking at? Like, I feel like, back in the day when I did, enterprise level kind of security stuff, we'd always try and figure out like, okay, what data do we have to secure, right? And what data do we not have to secure? Because that may change the dynamic of how we do stuff, right? It may make it easier, it may make it harder, right? It kind of depends on what you find.
Can I refine that a bit, Dave? Just as a question. It's not what data do we have to secure, right? Protect surface and attack surface. We have to protect all the data that's sensitive or that matters. Mm-hmm. But it's also like when we talk about network segmentation, we need to know where that data is, what's sensitive, what matters that we need to have segmented so that we can keep the other stuff that doesn't need to access it logically separated. Right. Okay. That's the essential thing. So it's a matter of where the data is and what kind of data we have. Right. So you were on the exact point. I just wanted to refine it just a smidge.
No. That's good. That's good.
Okay. So we need to know where the data is. And if we're playing along at home in Control 3, we will have started to build a data inventory at some point, right? We'll have started to say that. So I'm going to write down my one task that we need is we need to make sure that we have a data inventory. All right. So that's my one bullet I'm going to put up. What else, guys? What else do we want to come up with here?
I mean, I want to kind of comment on the data, identifying what data you're trying to protect. It's not always just the like non-public information, CUI. Sure. It's not always those things. Sometimes it's the data that can give you access to the other data, or the data that's separated and you put the pieces together and you can figure something else out. That's important to protect too. So just kind of want to comment on that.
Well, and this is actually a great point, Mark. I give you Matt points. They're not worth very much. They're non-transferable.
I've been saving them up.
You have? That's awesome. It's going to turn like a camel jacket at some point. But no, it's a great point you make is like, oh, I got lost in the camel jacket joke. Mark, refresh me where you just went. I apologize.
No, so it's not just the data you're protecting.
Oh, yeah.
It's
okay. Sorry. I'm back on track.
So see me in my face. Yeah.
I did. So the problem is that we often think meeting compliance. And I was just going to talk yesterday with an MSP, and I said it depends, which is the number one security answer of all time. But when you talk about what you just said, Mark, you're looking past the compliance and towards not getting punched in the face, or if getting punched in the face, dodging it so it's a glancing cheekbone blow and not a face punch. And so I think to your point is we need to actually think about not just where the data is, but the access to that data, the way we manage admin credentials, the way we manage accounts. And a lot of that's accounted for in other controls. right? As long as we're applying those broadly. But I just want people listening to keep your heart where Mark's heart was, because genuinely, if you're thinking about like, how would I pwn this account? Then no matter where the data is, nor how segmented it is, it's still going to be stolen, right? And so you have to think beyond that point, but it's a great call out. So Mark's bullet point is understand that we have to actually think about the access to that data path as well, right? So far,
Well,
that's what we got as bullet points. Go ahead.
And more so than that, and Mark, I'll give you Dave points, but they're absolutely worthless. Absolutely worthless. I don't think people think about the combination of data, right? A lot of people will say, "Oh, I've got this really important stuff that's sitting over here, and that's segmented off. But this other thing, it's not really a big deal. And then I got this other thing from HR that's not really a big deal." But when you add those, when they're additive, when you put them together, they actually create a really big deal, right? Like, so it's one of those things, like, we don't think about how the data interacts sometimes. So I think there's another control that's about data workflow, right? It's like how the data works together, right? So again, understanding one control can lead you down a lot of other controls, right? Like, so I think is Matt's
well, and
point
if you look at
all
this, well, and if you look at this illustration, all of the green dots on the left are dependent controls, right? They're things that
Right.
actually either flow, and it's a great way for us to call this out so people become familiar with it, right? Configure data access control lists and encrypt sensitive data in transit. Those are all things that'll depend on that, because what is in transit on that network we're about to talk about. So we may have to deal with what are we doing for those things. So great call out, Dave, is that remember the interdependence. But basically, so now we've come up with, right, we need to know where our data is, right? So we can start figuring out that location. We need to understand the impact of access to that data as well. Chris, do you have anything to add on some of this thing and how we might continue to add value to this? I'm sorry, and one more takeaway.
I think we've kind of skipped ahead a little bit here.
Let's do it. Back up.
The premise of this safeguard is to establish and maintain a secure network architecture. It doesn't say out of the gate, just make sure all your data is secure, because how do you do that if you don't have the architecture properly built? And I think as MSPs, when I go back in time, I think sometimes it's easier to properly configure the means to the end, even if we still struggle with understanding what it is that we're going to protect when we're done.
Yeah, I think as a call out, you're basically saying at least have the understanding of VLANs or physical network infrastructure, or if you get into cloud, other methodologies like SASE and other things.
Like what's no longer considered acceptable? A flat network's probably not a good network configuration, right? Like you can't do any of the things that this is going to call for. So let's start there.
Maybe I'll get made fun of for this, but that's where you live on the edge, right? Do any of you have a network schema that you apply to all your clients, at least try to apply for VLAN commonality, things like that? If not, I'll share mine. I mean, even if you do, I'll share mine, I suppose. But do you guys use a common schema for how you manage VLANs?
We do. And it just depends on the client. It depends on a lot of things, the complexity of their network. Like, how many people
true story.
rather what they're doing. But we have a basic one that we use so that we're not, VLAN 36 is not here, and it's the same. Like, we use the same one for printers. We try to use the same one for management and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Dave, same thing.
Yeah, same thing. We have a smaller client set, so we'll have clients that are as little as 5. So VLANing up 5 people is a little tricky, right? Like, oh, okay, yeah, we can VLAN your printer, the one printer that you have, and like so there are I think, like, it depends is a really important kind of prospect. But for us, absolutely, we have things that are segmented off, and the stuff that's risky, like IoT and stuff like that, I'm not going to have there. But I mean, talk a little bit about like how, like, we talk about this from a secure standpoint, but let's talk about it that availability standpoint. Is like, when you start segmenting this stuff, because it becomes complex, and it really starts to impact workflow at times, right? If we're not doing it well or correctly.
Yeah, 100%. To your point, the availability can be impacted as we try to do the segmentation or the principle of least privilege reduction that we're going to be talking about here in just a minute. But to your point of the segmentation, what I wanted to unpack first before we move on is it can help to have a template of knowing that VLAN 12 is going to be your IoT network, and that VLAN 99 is going to be your guest network, and that VLAN 1 is going to be your control plane potentially, and that VLAN 2 is going to, right? Having those things in a way that you know what that is helps normalize the segmentation. And Dave, even to your point of having one printer, I know that it's on 199, and I know that it's on VLAN 12, and I know that that means I'm going to say only allow these protocols that I need over. And what I want to cover under that is, when you're doing segmentation, it doesn't just mean make it flat and allow everything across everything, right? If you are going to segment, it can't just be because I can knock next door and get on the next network. Guess what?
Yeah.
There's only so much RFC space that I can scan, right? Like,
Right.
so I'm going to find the stuff connected. And so I think one of the things we're looking at is, don't just segment for the purpose of logical segmentation. Also try to figure out what things you need between those network segments, which brings us right to Dave's point of accessibility being impacted. If you do this right, you're going to try to make the least privilege that is needed between those networks, right? And it doesn't just stop there, but I'll pause there for anybody else to jump in. I think we've covered that segmentation can't just be separation. It needs to also be an attempt at firewalling, reducing what services can access, getting down to maybe even single devices, single MAC addresses, things of that nature, if you went that deep. But yeah.
So one of the things I want to touch on also is in terms of availability. This conversation maybe 5-10 years ago would be different. But availability for us also means, some of our employees are in the office sometimes they're not. We have procedures for, hey, I'm sitting at home and the power went out or my internet went out. Are they going to be sitting there for 3 hours doing nothing? Well, I hope not.
Right.
We have a protocol for hotspot, go to the a designated coffee house, throw on the VPN. That, depending on what you're working on, obviously, in sensitivity and things like that. But availability also, those things need to be taken into consideration too, because it's not 1999. We're not sitting in the office, and if you leave the office, you have to turn on PC Anywhere isn't working, can't use that anymore. Like, we're not. I just can't believe that neuron
that came out of your mouth,
anyway,
man. That was a weird one to come
Next
back.
is going to
Yeah.
say lap link.
It's been a while.
Oh
But,
man.
you know what I mean? So, but those have to be taken into consideration when designing your network as well.
Yeah. 100%. So anybody else?
Well, what are some of the things, like, you're talking about, having your printers off on a separate network.
Sure.
So is the idea that, okay, if this is all the printer network, I would never expect a PowerShell command to come from the printer side network into my control plane network. How do you technically start to think about there's never going to be a time where this happens? Like, how do you kind of start to break that down? Mark, do you have any strategies for that?
Wireshark, you could just look at the traffic, see what's talking, see what's not talking. Institutional knowledge, port 9100 is used for printing, I think, right? Or I'm an idiot, I don't remember.
That's where I would have gone with it, Mark. We just don't let those ports come across.
Well, yeah,
Dave, if I'm going to go and let a printer access the network or something access the printer, I want it to be directional towards the printer unless I'm scanning and it needs to reach out to some server or something. And if it needs SMB, then it's SMB. If it just needs HTTPS, I'm going to try to restrict HTTPS to whatever site it actually needs, the brother driver, and that's challenging. But to your point of like PowerShell or other things, Jason and I have teased, I'll live on a printer and do what I can, but I can only do what you allow me to access outside of that network or other devices or things in that nature. So the biggest answer for that is principle of least privilege, Dave, which is probably you just trying to pull my string on that conversation. But it is that center triangle or trapezoid there, or whatever it might be. Rhombi, I think it's a rhombi. Anyways, that piece says principle least privilege. What does that mean? It means only allowing enough privilege to do the things that are necessary. And to your point, you can find those things by either watching the firewall logs as you start to do a test implementation. You could do a firewall log that shows everything while it's actually there before you set those restrictions, and then say, what is it communicating on? And where is it going on a normal basis? And then try to discern, is that something you should allow? But principle of least privilege doesn't stop there. And I think a lot of people might miss this as well. I think the way I give Mark Menzies access to go change that network device also comes into play, because I could just remove those restrictions, if that makes sense, right? What do y'all want to, Chris, do you want to get riffed on that one a bit?
I just think that this is that reminder of why other controls are so important. I mean, this is a perfect example of where things like changing network type stuff requires probably knowing what assets need to be on those networks.
Hey, wait, didn't we talk about assets lists just last week? Like,
It seems like we
maybe.
might have been
Might
building
have-
up to this. This is crazy.
No, and I
Yeah.
look, I know we're joking around with this and we're having a lot of fun here and things like that, but the stuff is it's complex and it really does need a conversation with a team. Like it doesn't
Yeah.
this is so hard to do by yourself. Like it's so hard to write it down and like just like I don't have enough institutional knowledge to know everything. Period.
True story.
But group effort is actually simple, right, Dave? Like it's really not hard when you do it together.
It really isn't. Like, you know, we could take apart the working group. Like I on this working group am probably the least secure person in the room, and have the least amount of knowledge about cybersecurity. In other words, there's a lot of really smart people in the room with me, and I have learned so much by just listening and paying attention and asking questions and being part of the group. And I feel like I'm like you guys elevated me, right? And I think that
And
hap-
likewise. I mean, that's mutual, right? That's the way it works.
and I think that happens with our teams too. Is that when we start having these conversations in a group and we do a deep dive, that group think is really important. It builds culture. It helps
Builds buy-in
exactly.
as
It
well,
helps.
right?
It helps people want to do this stuff. And honestly, look, a lot of our guys have a lot of access because they need it, right? Because they have jobs that they've got to do. Okay, yep, maybe not all of it, but
Teasing.
a lot of it. They can turn all this stuff off. Like we know, like
Yeah.
how many of us have sat there and gone, this isn't working. I'm just going to turn this off and see if it works. Oh yeah, it works. Okay, cool. It's fixed. I'm not going to do anything else, right? Like that. But if you do that in a group, the group can help you figure that kind of stuff out.
You know, Dave, this kind of reminds me of, you know, when trying to also make sure that you don't have configuration drift and such. I was setting up, you know, a while ago in Azure. I was like, ooh, if I put a lock on this and I put a lock on this, you know, no one could change that. No one could change that. Well, apparently changing statuses in like, you know, in Azure for like through incident response and things like that. If you lock it, no one can make any changes to even change the status of an ongoing incident in Sentinel. And I'm like, wait a minute. So like I have to unlock. So it's just, there's always these, you're always going to get to that roadblock. And then my recommendation is let it go, move on to the next thing, document it, you know, that there's a deficiency there, and then move on, because the goal isn't to be perfect here. The goal is to just move forward.
Right,
That's probably the best nugget out of this, Mark, is based on what Dave was saying and how complex this is and how much it ties together and the group think and all those things. It's always back to don't let perfect be the enemy of good.
Yeah.
Like at the end of the day, it's back to the same common point of just get started, start working through it. And if we were doing this in a real simulation, some of the actions that should be taken away is, hey, why don't we get together with our team and decide what is that standard we want? What are those things we need as minimum segmentation? And where are those logical points? Is it IoT, and IoT should never talk internally, but to talk outside? Is it isolation on that particular network? Is that what matters to me in IoT? Am I getting even more micro segmented inside that network? It's things to
I
that
think
nature.
you're getting awfully subjective there, Matt Lee. And I think that
No, you mean summative, probably, because there's
Okay.
lots of IoT that need to speak to other IoT, or other IoT need to speak to other things on the
I
network.
guess what I was
going
gonna-
to them, but yeah.
I guess my point was our goal here isn't to decide what types of devices need to talk to what networks for the MSPs watching, but in fact to consider what does those assets need to talk to, rather than just turn.
Yeah, but back up a bit. I really think there's something to be pushed back on here. What I mean is, I have a list of asset classes, and those classes are separate so that they can be separated, right? And there are some that need to natively live together. Like maybe my desktops and laptops need to live on the same network. They have the same needs. But maybe I could decide my IoT as a general category is at least something that needs to be on a different VLAN. Now, to your point of what needs to talk to what, that's more of a principle of least privilege. I'm simply saying we need to make sure that you should start with what categorizations are you willing to work with? And it is very native to go along the ones like what they said, right? The things that are inside the network, IoT, servers, right? Those are the things. And so I don't know if you all follow a similar track, Mark, and I just want to make sure this isn't lost on MSPs. I had a server VLAN, right? I had a different VLAN if I needed something to be DMZ'd. I had a different, all I'm really saying is when you're talking about segmentation, it is very valid to go through and look at which ones need to be separated And then to your point, Chris, and I don't want to miss this for people, sometimes people build crappy tools and they have to be on the same native VLAN and they have to work only in this way. And Chris, to your point, you'll only know that as you start digging into how those function. But it is,
Right.
in my opinion, better to start, and it's easier to start with a template of the way I'm going to function in network segmentation, and then deviate from that template rather
Sure.
than try to build
Well,
it.
and
every time, if that
and
makes
Mark,
sense.
that's exactly what you brought up, right? Like, hey, you're gonna find roadblocks. You're gonna find things that need to be on your
Always
primary
Yeah.
control plane that you don't want there, or because they pose a security risk. Document it. Make sure there's a process for it.
Compensating control if you can.
And find a compensating control for it, right? Like that is.
Even if it's administrative, sometimes it has to be administrative. Hey, we know this is a problem. Don't do that.
Don't do
sign
that.
the AUP. AUP
Right.
says don't do that. Don't do that.
Yeah,
No.
yeah, exactly.
And so I think it just brings us back to like, so taking the action this week. So the thing that we want to do this week, we have about 5 minutes left. The thing that we want to do this week is really dive into a control. Take one of these controls and tear it apart.
Argue it as a team.
Yeah,
right?
see what it looks like. Have the conversation of, hey, this is going to break everything if we put this in. Okay, great. How do we put this in without breaking everything? And start to have that conversation. And look, if your team is one person, like I get it. It makes it tough. That's why Tuesdays, Chris, I don't know times. I probably should have written that down, but Tuesdays there's the Trustmark peer call, right? Where you can jump on and have a conversation with other people that are going through the Trustmark. I'm sure there are similar things for CIS controls and stuff like that. Matt, I know you've talked about some of those types of groups where you can go in and just say, hey, I don't know what I'm doing. Help me. Right.
Yeah,
like,
100%.
and it's peer help. And that's something to recognize and really dive into when you're going through this process. You're not by yourself. All you have to do is ask for help. The ISAL, you can jump in the CompTIA ISAL. Lots of people in there will help you out with Trustmark. I know I will help you probably poorly, not nearly as well as some of the other
whatever.
people.
He keeps kicking himself in the face.
I know that humility thing there. It's fine.
No,
Dave's one of the smarter dudes I get to talk to. So
I know how smart the other dudes are in this call. So I'm humility is I'm just lower than you guys. That's all. I'm not saying I'm bad. I'm just not as good.
I think. Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
To what Dave's saying, though, in my experience, what I would find in the past is that I would be less likely to reach out to someone who seemed more knowledgeable, and that was just because, I don't know, intimidation. I don't like admitting that I'm over this now, but I didn't like admitting when I didn't know something. But I found over time that those that are more knowledgeable didn't get there by accident. Matt is the summary of all of his mistakes and failures and such, and all the knowledge that others have imparted upon him.
Yeah.
Me too, exactly.
Yeah.
So the more knowledgeable someone is perceptually, and they actually know their stuff, they're probably more likely to want to help you than someone who's less knowledgeable, simply because they understand the value of that knowledge and want to help others and learn from them as well. So
and it's a form of giving back too, right? Because a lot of these guys had somebody walk them through this 10 years ago or 5 years ago or something like that. And it's like, hey, I'm paying it forward, right? Somebody did it for me. I'm going to do it for somebody else.
Yeah.
One more paste here. Yeah, I wanted. Hold on just a sec. Mark, one of the things that you said just a second ago, I really wanted to say something about because it resonates with me. The definition of expert isn't that you know it all. It's that you have tried a lot. Right. And I'm summarizing a smidge, but that you have continued to try and learn. And hopefully you're not a numpty that doesn't learn from your mistakes, in which case, your name's Matt Lee. But no, genuinely, expert is really more about growing your knowledge by continuing to test. And I like these type of forums because people push back. Right, Chris pushes back on me. I push back on Mark. Mark pushes back on Dave, and so forth and so on. And it really does refine your way of how you understand this and what you're going to be doing. And so this call to action right now, I just want to make sure that everybody knows is just go sit down in the next week with some of your teammates. It doesn't have to be all of them. And talk through a safeguard and talk about what would this do to us, to Dave's point, right? Would this cause us a problem where we just literally cannot function? Or would we be able to implement this? And if not, what do we do as a compensating control? And maybe that, Mark, you said an administrative control. Let's dig into that just a smidge. What if it literally, to your point, is I'm going to put in the acceptable use policy that this device has to be here, but no new devices will be added in this way or other things. And maybe you set a policy that says every new product we're going to use can't be like this jackleg that needs us to be in the layer 1 VLAN of the same management network, right? Like
Exactly. And maybe some sort of way of detecting when a bad thing would happen instead of
a rule.
A rule or something. Yeah.
And maybe micro segmentation where you have some ability to filter between devices in the same network that do need those same broadcast capabilities, if that might be what's driving it, right? Not to
and then you can start to look at, like, once you have like what you're needing for a compensating control, now you can go look at tools. Now you can go have the conversations around, hey, we need this thing to plug in here to help us out, right?
Yeah. And I think this piece too, I just want to do it because we have a great comment from the audience. But at the end, the soft skills are more important than the security protocols. I think, I don't know about more important, but I will say if you try to deliver the security protocols without any of the soft skills as an organization, it won't go very well.
You get more flies with honey or bees with honey or whatever than you do with vinegar. I don't know. Maybe I butchered that one, but
no, it's good enough. Good enough. And maybe it's a perfect thing to end on. Dave, we've covered, in the last few weeks, and I appreciate you leading this group here. But we've covered in the last few weeks, first, have an ISO. Have an asset list, because if you don't have an asset list, you can't do anything. You don't even know where your attack plane is. Imagine when you start talking about networks, what we didn't cover today is which networks, and even what is a network now, right? Is Starbucks my network?
Oh, don't start, please.
Sorry, too far.
We're not opening that can of worms.
Not weeds. Back to not weeds.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So first is ISO. Second, have an asset list and get started down that path. And even then, you realized you weren't going to be perfect in the beginning. And now deep dive on a control. And really, it's to say, as you start to implement any safeguard, deep dive into it. Try to understand it enough in your own context today.
And do one a week, one a month. Just get started, guys. Just start. That's all we're talking about this month is taking action and getting started.
Okay. Well, we'll leave you guys to it. Everybody that was here, wonderful. Thank you so much. And everybody in the audience, it was great seeing everybody. Miles also popped in. Let's see what he said here.
FBI van.
That's note to self. By the way, Miles, you should go look out Wiggle. You might not want to say that on live air. No, I tease. All right. Appreciate